"We can't come. Mom's fine. Monica's hosting her charity gala tonight, and we can't just walk out." Those were the words my son Daniel said to Dr. Patel while I was lying on the operating table, my heart already failing for the second time. The heart monitor beeped so wildly it sounded like a countdown to my own ending. Dr. Patel pressed the phone closer to his ear and said quietly, "Mr. Hayes, it's serious. Your mother's condition is critical. You should come immediately." From the other end, laughter mixed with music and the faint clinking of glasses. "We'll come tomorrow," Daniel said. "It's not a good look to abandon our guests." Then the call ended. That's when the doctor looked at me helpless. "They said they can't come, Mrs. Hayes." I didn't answer. I couldn't. A strange calm spread through my body, the kind that only comes when pain has gone past the point of screaming. I stared at the hospital ceiling, its white tiles flickering under the fluorescent light, and thought, this is what dying alone feels like. My fingers trembled not from fear but from rage, so pure it numbed everything else. After 67 years of surviving heartbreaks, debts, and loneliness, this was the moment that finally broke me. And as the night deepened, one thought kept pulsing in my mind: if they could miss my last heartbeat for a party, they could live without me forever. The hospital was cold that night, colder than any December I remembered in Savannah. The hum of machines was the only company I had. I could smell the sterile disinfectant metallic and sharp the scent of survival and endings. I turned my head slightly and saw the clock on the wall, 2:03 a.m. Outside, rain tapped against the glass, soft and steady like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. The nurse on duty, a young woman named Nora, adjusted my blanket with careful hands. "Try to rest, Mrs. Hayes," she whispered. Her voice had a warmth my own children hadn't used with me in years. She couldn't have been more than 30, yet her eyes carried compassion that my family seemed to have misplaced long ago. "You have sons, Mrs. Hayes?" she asked softly. "Two," I said, my throat dry. "One's an engineer. The other works in finance. Good men once." Nora smiled politely, not knowing what to say. "They'll come tomorrow," she murmured, as if to comfort me. Yes, I lied. When she left the room, the silence pressed in again, thick as grief. I closed my eyes, trying to imagine Daniel's face, but all I could see was Monica's, the perfect wife, the hostess, the woman whose parties seemed to matter more than my life. I could almost hear her laugh, that crisp, practiced sound that filled every room she entered. I had known from the moment I met her that she'd claim my son piece by piece until there was nothing left for me. But I'd never imagined she'd take him even from my deathbed. The rain outside grew heavier, a constant whisper against the window. Somewhere down the hallway, a machine beeped steadily, a rhythm that mocked my failing heart. My chest still ached from the earlier spasms, and each breath felt borrowed. I remembered how Dr. Patel had looked at me earlier that night, his voice gentle but firm. "The most important thing now is for you to stay calm," he had said. Calm. I had wanted to laugh. How do I stay calm when my children think I'm less important than a guest list he hadn't answered? What could he say? He'd already heard Daniel's voice, the careless tone of a man choosing convenience over conscience. The words "Mom's fine" kept echoing inside my head like a cruel lullaby. That sentence had been the soundtrack of my later years. Every time I'd needed them, every time I'd called with trembling hands or quiet loneliness, it had been the same. Mom's fine. When I slipped on the stairs 2 winters ago and sprained my ankle, Daniel said, "Mom's fine. She's tough." When Ethan forgot my birthday, he told his wife, "She's fine. She doesn't care about those things." I had been fine for so long that they believed it. Maybe I had believed it too. The taste of bitterness rose in my throat, metallic and familiar. I thought of all the nights I'd stayed up sewing Daniel's school costumes, of the lunches I'd packed, the bills I'd paid alone after his father walked out. I'd worked 2 jobs to keep them fed and safe. I'd believed that sacrifice guaranteed love. But love, I learned too late, doesn't come with guarantees. The door opened quietly, and Ruth stepped in. Her gray coat was damp from the rain, her umbrella dripping on the floor. "Good Lord, Margaret," she said, softly pulling a chair close. "You look pale as paper." "I suppose dying will do that to a person," I said, managing a small smile. "Don't talk like that," she scolded gently. "You're too stubborn to die." She reached for my hand and held it between hers. Did the boys call? I shook my head. They're busy. With what? A party? She sighed, the sound somewhere between pity and anger. Honey, sometimes blood means less than kindness. You always say that, I murmured. Because it's always true, she replied. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain. The machines beside me beeped in rhythm, keeping time for the life that refused to quit. Ruth squeezed my hand. You'll get through this, she said. You always do. I wanted to believe her. For decades, I had gotten through everything: divorce, loneliness, poverty, disrespect. But lying there with tubes in my arm and a heart that betrayed me, every few beats I felt something shift. Maybe survival wasn't the same as living. Maybe I was done surviving. A shadow crossed the doorway. Dr. Patel peeked in, clipboard in hand. How's our fighter? He asked softly. Still here, I said. He gave a faint smile. You're lucky, Mrs. Hayes. Not everyone comes back after what you went through tonight. Lucky, I repeated. The word tasted strange. 3 heart failures in one night. My son's at a party. Yes, I'm the luckiest woman in Savannah. He looked down, embarrassed. I'm sorry. I called them. I told them the truth. They declined. Don't apologize for their choices, doctor. That's not your burden. He nodded and left quietly. Ruth's hand tightened around mine. What are you thinking? She asked. That I've spent 67 years being reliable, predictable, available, I whispered. And for what? So they could treat me like a spare tire. Don't say that. It's true. Maybe it's time I stop being available. Ruth's eyes softened. What do you mean? I mean, maybe the best way to make them see me is to disappear. Ruth blinked, startled. Margaret, not tonight, I said. But soon. She didn't argue. She just sat there holding my hand as the rain eased into a quiet drizzle. My body felt heavy, but my mind had never been clearer. I looked at the city lights through the window. The hospital sat on a small hill, and from here I could see the faint glow of the Grand Magnolia Hotel, where Monica's gala was still raging. Somewhere in that golden light, my sons were smiling, for pictures, laughing, pretending to be good men. I imagined them toasting champagne, completely unaware that their mother had come within inches of never waking up again. They chose her party over my life, I whispered. Ruth followed my gaze. Then let that choice be the last they ever make for you. I turned back to her, surprised by the steel in her tone. What are you saying? I'm saying, maybe it's time you stop forgiving people who don't even say sorry. The words hit deep. She was right. I had forgiven so many times that the word itself had lost its meaning. I had accepted scraps of affection thinking they were enough. But tonight, as the clock ticked closer to dawn, I realized I didn't owe anyone forgiveness. Not anymore. The lights flickered once, and for a moment the entire room went dark. The machines continued their steady beeping, the rain had stopped, and the smell of antiseptic hung thick in the air. I could almost feel my life balancing on a scale, one side heavy, with memories of giving, the other side empty with what I'd received in return. When the power returned, Ruth had fallen asleep in her chair. I watched her breathe, grateful for this one soul who stayed. My chest ached again, not from pain but from the weight of clarity. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about how to survive tomorrow. I was thinking about how to leave everything behind. I closed my eyes, whispering into the dark. If love can fade, so can guilt. And with that, a strange peace settled over me. Tomorrow would come, and so would my plan. But tonight, I let the silence fill the room, and for the first time in my life, it didn't scare me. It felt like freedom waiting at the door. I was 24 when Robert Hayes walked out of our little house in Savannah, leaving me with 2 boys and a mountain of unpaid bills. Daniel was 7. Ethan was barely 2. And all I had to my name were a few teaching credentials and a stubborn heart that refused to quit. I remember standing at the kitchen sink that morning, holding the letter he'd left beside the coffee pot. No goodbye, no apology, just an explanation that he needed to find himself. I found myself too, but in a very different way. I found myself in classrooms filled with restless children in night shifts, grading papers under flickering lights, in small miracles like getting both boys fed before sunrise. Those early years were a blur of exhaustion and purpose. I'd come home from teaching, make macaroni for the boys, then leave again to tutor neighborhood kids for extra money. Sometimes I'd sew uniforms until midnight, the hum of the old singer machine filling the silence Robert had left behind. Every stitch I made was a promise that my sons would never know hunger the way I once did. I told myself that sacrifice was love in action, that every sleepless night was an investment in their future. And for a while it seemed to work. Daniel grew up serious and disciplined, always wanting to make me proud. Ethan was the opposite, sweet, impulsive, a dreamer. When Daniel graduated with honors, I sold my mother's wedding ring to buy him his first laptop. When Ethan wanted guitar lessons, I skipped dinner for weeks to afford them. Each choice carved a little more out of me, but I didn't mind. I believed that a mother's love had no expiration date. The first time I saw Daniel bring a girl home, I was so proud I cried. Her name was Monica Carter, a poised, elegant young woman with perfect posture and nails that never seemed to touch a dish. She shook my hand like she was closing a deal. "It's so lovely to finally meet you, Mrs. Hayes," she said, looking around the small house I had managed to keep all these years. "It's charming." The way she said that word made it sound like old. Daniel beamed at her as if she'd hung the moon. I remember setting the table that night, the chipped plates, the little vase of daisies I'd picked from the yard, hoping to make a good impression. But Monica barely ate. "You cook beautifully," she said with a polite smile, "though I usually avoid carbs. Daniel knows how strict I am." I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. Later that evening, she took Daniel aside, thinking I couldn't hear. "Your mom's sweet," she whispered, "but maybe next time we can have dinner somewhere modern." After that, dinners at my house became rare. Within months, Monica had him wrapped neatly in the silk ribbon of her world, a world of charity galas, designer kitchens, and people who pronounced Savannah like it was a quaint exhibit. The first Christmas after their wedding, she called to say, "Daniel and I are spending the holidays with my parents this year. They have a big house in Charleston. Maybe next year we'll do Savannah." Next year never came. Ethan, meanwhile, was carving his own path. He'd always been the gentler one, less driven by ambition and more by curiosity. He met Clara at the bank, where he worked, quiet, graceful, and so careful with her words that it was hard to tell if she ever said what she truly felt. When he brought her home for Sunday dinner, she smiled and said, "Mrs. Hayes, I've heard so much about your lasagna." I glowed with pride until she added, "It's a bit heavy for me, though. I usually eat lighter." I laughed, trying to hide the sting. Over the years, those little comments piled up like pebbles in my shoe, too small to confront, too painful to ignore. "You should dress more age-appropriate," Monica once told me at a family barbecue, smiling for the neighbors. "That mustard cardigan is cute, though. Very vintage." "You mean old," I said, trying to laugh. "Oh no, I mean timeless," she replied, squeezing my arm as if pity were affection. Ethan's wife Clara was subtler. She never openly criticized, but she had a way of turning kindness into distance. When I invited them for Sunday dinners, she would say, "That's so sweet of you, Margaret, but we've been trying to simplify our weekends. Less cooking, more takeout." At first, I believed it. Then I realized simplify was just another word for exclude. I tried not to take it personally. I told myself they were busy, modern, independent. But every time I saw photos of their family gatherings online, Monica's curated brunches, Clara's quiet weekends by the lake, I felt that old ache of invisibility. I had become the mother they mentioned but never visited. The turning point came on my 60th birthday. I'd cooked an entire feast, roast chicken, peach cobbler, everything they loved as children. I waited all day, the table set candles, lit the food cooling slowly in the oven. They called at 8:00 p.m. Daniel said, "Sorry, Mom." We lost track of time at the event. Ethan texted, "Sorry, work emergency. Love you." I sat alone at the table, the candles burning down to nothing. I ate the cobbler cold, tasting sugar and salt at once, because tears kept falling into it. That night I realized I had trained them to believe my love was unconditional, and unconditional to them meant endless forgiveness. Ruth was the only one who dared to say it out loud. "Margaret, you gave them everything," she said one afternoon as we shared coffee on her porch. "But honey, if you give without boundaries, people start thinking you owe them." I shook my head. "They're my boys. They'll come around." Ruth sighed. "You've been saying that since Daniel forgot your Mother's Day brunch." She was right, but admitting it felt like betrayal. I still clung to hope the way a drowning person clings to driftwood. I had built my entire identity on being their mother. What would I be if I let that go? Then came the last straw, though I didn't know it then. Daniel called one evening, his voice unusually polite. "Mom, Monica and I found a new house. It's in an amazing neighborhood, just what we've dreamed of, but we're short on the down payment. Could you help us?" Temporarily, I hesitated. My savings were modest, meant to carry me through retirement. But hearing his voice, the little boy who once promised to buy me a mansion when I grow up, I couldn't say no. I sold the small bungalow where we'd lived for 30 years, the one with the lemon tree in the yard and the marks of their heights on the kitchen door frame. I moved into a small apartment near downtown with creaky floors and no yard, while Daniel and Monica posed for photos in front of their dream home. When I showed up unexpectedly one day holding a chocolate cake, his childhood favorite Monica opened the door halfway. "Oh, Margaret, you should have called first. We have guests." "I just wanted to drop this off," I said, forcing a smile. "Daniel loves chocolate. He's been cutting back on sweets," she said, taking the cake as if it were radioactive. "But thank you. I'll make sure he sees it." She never invited me in. I stood on the porch of the house I had helped buy, hearing laughter inside that didn't include me. That night I cried myself to sleep for the first time in years. Ethan came next. His small electronics business was failing, and he called asking for $8,000 to save it. I hesitated again. "It's my last savings, Ethan," I said. "You'll have it back in 3 months, Mom, promise." I never saw that money again. The business folded, the calls stopped, and the word promise became another broken thing between us. By the time I turned 67, I was no longer naive. I still loved my sons, but I no longer believed love guaranteed loyalty. They visited less, called out of obligation, sent flowers on holidays they forgot until the last minute. Ruth kept warning me, "You're fading from their lives, Margie. They're moving on without you. That's what they're supposed to do," I said. "Not like this, honey," she replied. "They're not moving on, they're erasing you." That conversation stayed with me. Every word of it returned the night my heart failed and they didn't show up. Lying in that hospital bed, I thought about every recovery I'd made. I recovered when Robert left. I recovered when I lost the house. I recovered when they forgot birthdays when they borrowed, and never repaid when they chose their wives' comfort over my presence. I recovered every time they bruised me with neglect, until now. Because this time it wasn't money or words or distance. It was my life hanging by a thread, and they chose a party. That was the night something inside me changed. I stopped feeling like a mother waiting for her sons. I started feeling like a woman who'd finally learned the cost of unconditional love. And as I lay there watching the rain turn into dawn, I whispered to the ceiling, I recovered from everything, except being forgotten by my own blood. The morning of my 67th birthday began with the smell of rain and silence. Savannah was always quiet after a storm, but that morning the stillness felt heavier, as if the city itself had forgotten me. I made coffee in the small kitchen of my apartment the same way I did every morning. 2 sugars, a splash of milk, 1 teaspoon of hope. I sat by the window waiting for the phone to ring. It didn't. The only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock I'd brought from my old house, its rhythm louder than the years between me and my sons. At 9:00, my phone buzzed once. It was Ruth. "Happy birthday, honey," her voice sang through the receiver, warm and bright. "Don't you dare sit around waiting for those boys to call. You hear me, go out. Get yourself a slice of cake." I smiled. "You sound like my conscience." "Then listen to me for once," she said. "Love yourself today." When the call ended, the silence returned, but this time it hurt less. I'd stopped expecting grand gestures long ago. I just wanted to know they remembered. By noon, the only messages on my phone were from my pharmacy reminding me to refill my prescription and from a store offering birthday discounts. I poured another cup of coffee and whispered, "Happy birthday, Margaret," just to hear the words spoken out loud. The rain started again around 2 o'clock, tapping gently against the window. I was watching the drops race down the glass when the phone rang. For a second, my heart lifted. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. "Daniel," I said, unable to hide the relief in my voice. "I didn't think you'd remember." "Of course I did, Mom," he replied, but his tone carried that distracted energy I knew too well. "Listen, I just wanted to remind you about Monica's charity birthday gala this Saturday. You got the invitation right. I froze. Saturday. Yeah, he said cheerfully. At the Grand Magnolia Hotel. Monica's turning 40 and she's planned this huge thing, silent auction, live music, champagne bar. You'll love it. That's the same weekend as my birthday, I said quietly. There was a pause long enough for me to hope he might realize. Then Monica's voice came faintly from the background, bright and impatient. Daniel, tell her not to forget the dress code, formal, no sequins. He laughed, muffling the phone. You hear that, Mom? She's driving me crazy with these details. Daniel, I said, my voice steadier, now you do remember that my birthday is Sunday. He hesitated for half a heartbeat. Oh, right, yeah, of course. We'll celebrate at the gala. You'll love it, it's for a good cause. Your wife's birthday gala, I said. Not mine. Come on, Mom, don't make this about you. I almost dropped the phone. The words cut deeper than he realized. I'll see you there, I managed, and hung up before my voice could break. I sat at the table for a long time, staring at my reflection in the dark coffee. It struck me how strange it felt to be invisible to the people you loved most. When they were little, I used to bake their birthday cakes after midnight, decorating them with crooked frosting hearts and mismatched candles. I'd sneak into their room in the morning, singing happy birthday softly so I wouldn't wake the neighbors. Now my birthday was just an obstacle on Monica's calendar. By Friday, the city was buzzing about the gala. The Grand Magnolia was one of those places that smelled of old money and lilies, where even the chandeliers seemed to look down on you. I stood outside its glass doors that evening, clutching a small silver-wrapped box, the bracelet I'd bought for Monica with what was left of my savings. The cashier at the store had smiled when I handed over the bills. That's a beautiful piece, she said. Is it for your daughter? I'd smiled back. Something like that. Inside, the air smelled of perfume and champagne. A string quartet played softly in the corner. The guests sparkled, sequins, tuxedos, manicured hands holding crystal glasses. I felt like a ghost wandering into someone else's dream. Monica spotted me first. Her smile froze for half a second before she glided over her red gown, hugging her like perfection. Margaret, she exclaimed, what a surprise. You made it. You invited me, I said quietly. Oh, right, she laughed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Of course. Well, come in. I'm not sure there's a seat, but mingle. Enjoy yourself. She took the gift from my hands before I could say anything. How lovely. But you shouldn't have. Really. It's just a small thing, I said. A silver bracelet. I thought you'd like it. She looked at the box as though it might contain something fragile or unfashionable. How sweet. Thank you. Then she turned and disappeared into the crowd before I could even see her reaction. I found an empty spot near the bar and watched. Daniel was across the room laughing with his colleagues, a glass of champagne in hand. He looked happy, confident, comfortable, completely at home. I waited for his eyes to find me, to wave, to acknowledge me. They didn't. The band started playing something upbeat. People danced, glasses clinked, someone toasted to Monica's grace and generosity. I wanted to leave, but my legs wouldn't move. A woman beside me whispered to her husband, "Who's that older lady near the bar?" Daniel Hayes's mother. I think he said, not lowering his voice enough. She insists on showing up to everything. They both smiled, the polite smiles of people who didn't know how cruel they sounded. I turned away, staring at the golden chandeliers until they blurred. That's when I saw Monica on stage, microphone in hand, glowing in the spotlight. "Tonight's about celebration and giving," she said. "I couldn't have done this without my wonderful husband." Daniel walked up to join her, kissed her cheek, and waved at the crowd. They looked perfect together, like an advertisement for success. And there I was, standing in the back, holding an empty glass, pretending it didn't hurt. I slipped out quietly before dessert. The night air was humid, carrying the faint scent of gardenias from the courtyard. My shoes clicked on the marble steps, each sound echoing louder in the emptiness of the parking lot. When I reached my car, I sat behind the wheel and let the tears fall freely. The radio played something soft and slow, an old country song about love and letting go. I thought about the silver bracelet, probably unopened, and felt an ache in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. By the time I got home, it was almost midnight. The apartment felt smaller than usual, like the walls were closing in. I turned on the lamp and its yellow glow spilled over the worn furniture. On the table lay a single cupcake Ruth had dropped off earlier that day. A small candle stuck crookedly in the center. I lit it, whispering, "Make a wish, Margaret." But for the first time I had none left. I blew out the flame and watched the smoke curl upward, fading into nothing. My chest tightened. I told myself it was just fatigue, the same dull ache that came with age and stress. I sat on the couch, rubbing the spot just above my heart, but the pressure didn't go away. It pulsed deeper, sharper, as if something inside me was folding in on itself. I tried to stand, but the room tilted. I reached for the table, knocking over the empty cup. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. The clock on the wall ticked louder and louder. Midnight. My birthday had passed. No calls, no visits. Just the echo of laughter from a party across town. I whispered their names, Daniel, Ethan, like prayers, slipping through my lips, and sank slowly to my knees. The pain spread through my jaw, my arm, my back. It wasn't sudden, it was deliberate, cruel, like my body had been waiting for permission to give up. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled again. I crawled toward the phone, my vision blurring. I managed to dial Daniel's number, and the ringtone played against the sound of my own heartbeat. He answered on the second ring, his voice still cheerful. "Hey, Mom, you okay? We just got home from the gala." "Daniel," I gasped. "Something's wrong. My chest." "Mom, calm down. Did you take something for it? Maybe chamomile tea?" "It's not tea," I whispered. "It hurts. You're probably just anxious. It was a long day." "Get some rest." "Okay, we'll stop by tomorrow." "Tomorrow," I repeated, and the phone slipped from my hand. The last thing I heard before the darkness took me was his voice saying, "Love you, Mom," as if that word could still mean something after everything. The sound of sirens cut through the rain like a cry that belonged to someone else. When I opened my eyes, I was already in the back of an ambulance, bright lights flashing above me, the air thick with antiseptic and fear. A paramedic pressed a mask to my face. "Stay with us, ma'am. You're having a heart attack." I wanted to tell him I already knew. I wanted to tell him that my heart had been breaking for years, that this was just its way of finally surrendering. But all that came out was a whisper, barely a breath. "Call my sons." The paramedic nodded and shouted something to his partner. I closed my eyes and drifted in and out of consciousness as the sirens wailed through the streets of Savannah. The rain on the roof of the ambulance sounded like 1,000 clocks ticking down. When I opened my eyes again, there were people above me, faces half hidden behind masks, moving fast, voices overlapping. 3 cardiac arrests, someone said. Charged to 200. Then darkness. When I came to, I was in a hospital room. Machines beeped steadily beside me, a cold rhythm of survival. My chest felt like it had been split open and stitched back together with thread made of fire. The fluorescent lights were blinding. I heard the low murmur of a nurse talking to someone outside the room. "She's stable for now," she said, "but she needs family." "Did you call them?" the doctor asked. "Yes," she replied, lowering her voice. "They said, they're at an event, a charity gala. The wife's birthday." The doctor sighed heavily. "Call again." When he entered my room, his eyes were kind but tired. "Mrs. Hayes, you're very lucky," he said. "You've had a massive heart attack. You went into arrest 3 times during transport." His voice blurred. "We called your sons. They said they'll come in the morning." I blinked at the ceiling. "In the morning," I repeated. "That's very considerate of them." He looked uncomfortable. "You need rest. Stress won't help your recovery." "Doctor," I said, my voice thin but steady. "What do you call the moment when you realize you mean nothing to the people you lived for?" He hesitated. "I don't think there's a medical term for that. There should be," I whispered. He left quietly and the door clicked shut behind him. The room was silent except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. I turned my head and saw the rain still falling outside, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold. For a moment, I tried to remember the last time Daniel had called me just to talk, not out of obligation. I couldn't. My eyes drifted toward the clock, 3:10 a.m. Ruth was sitting in the chair beside the bed, still wearing the same damp coat from the night before. She had one hand resting on my blanket as if afraid I'd slip away if she let go. "You scared the hell out of me," she said softly when she noticed I was awake. "You were gone for a minute there." "Gone," I echoed. Did they call? Her lips pressed into a thin line? "They said they'll come tomorrow." I closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I said again the word tasting like ashes. The door opened, and Dr. Patel stepped back in holding his phone. Mrs. Hayes, he said carefully, I spoke to your son again. I explained the situation. I told him this could be your last night. And he said, the doctor hesitated, glancing at Ruth. He said, Mom's strong. She always pulls through. My breath caught in my throat. And Ethan, he said they'll come after the event. His wife's hosting guests. Ruth made a small sound of disbelief. They're unbelievable. I turned my head toward the window. The rain had slowed to a mist. No, I said quietly. They're exactly who they've become. For a while, no one spoke. The room felt too big, too clean, too alive for how empty I felt. I could still hear faint laughter in my memory, the sound of Daniel at that party, the echo of champagne glasses clinking. It was strange how the mind could replay the cruelest things so vividly. You should try to rest, Ruth said, adjusting my blanket. The doctor's right. I can't, I said. Every time I close my eyes, I see them laughing. The nurse Nora came in a little later, carrying a tray with water and medicine. How are you feeling, Mrs. Hayes? She asked kindly. Like I died, I said, forcing a faint smile. Because I did. 3 times. She froze, unsure whether to laugh. Well, you came back. That counts for something, does it? I asked, coming back to what she placed the tray down and hesitated. Sometimes people come back because they still have something left to do. Her words lingered after she left, floating in the sterile air. Something left to do. The thought gnawed at me. Maybe she was right. Maybe I did have something left to do. The next morning, the light filtered softly through the blinds, pale and thin. I must have drifted off because I woke to the sound of the door opening. For a moment, I thought it was them. But it was only Dr. Patel again, clipboard in hand. You're a miracle, Mrs. Hayes, he said. We had you for 4 minutes. 4 minutes technically dead, he explained. But you came back. I looked down at my hands, at the thin IV line threading into my veins. And while I was dead, I said my children were worried about their guest list. He didn't reply. Doctors are trained to fix what they can see, not what's invisible. When he left, Ruth leaned forward. You don't have to see them again if you don't want to, she said. You can cut them off, start fresh. I shook my head slowly. No, that's not enough. Then what? She asked. They made a choice, I said. Now it's my turn. Ruth's brow furrowed. Margaret, don't do anything reckless. Reckless, I smiled faintly. Ruth, my whole life has been spent waiting for people who never showed up. Maybe it's time I stop waiting. The nurse returned around noon to check my vitals. Your blood pressure is rising again, she said, frowning. Are you thinking about something upsetting? I almost laughed. I'm thinking about 67 years of being reliable. That sounds heavy, she said softly. It is, I replied, but I think I'm done carrying it. After she left, I stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks that spidered across the paint. I wondered if those cracks had always been there, or if I was only now noticing them. Maybe they'd been there the whole time, just like the cracks in my family. That evening, I heard laughter outside my window, probably hospital staff sharing a joke on their break. The sound should have comforted me, but it didn't. It only reminded me that life went on with or without me. I thought of Monica in her sequined gown, smiling under those golden chandeliers, clinking glasses with people who would never know the price of their glittering night. They'd tell stories about how perfect the gala was, how the decorations sparkled, how generous Monica was. None of them would know that while they toasted her, I was dying alone in a cold room 2 miles away. My eyes burned, but I refused to cry again. The tears had run their course. They chose a party, I whispered to the darkness, so I'll choose peace. The rain began again, soft against the glass, and I felt something inside me settle. Not anger, just certainty. I had spent my entire life giving. Now it was time to take back what little of it was left. I turned my head toward Ruth, who had fallen asleep again in the chair. The lines on her face looked softer in the glow of the hallway light. You were right, I whispered. Blood means less than kindness. My voice barely made a sound, but it felt like a vow. I closed my eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of the monitor. Every beep was a reminder that I was still here and that I had work to do. Tomorrow, I decided, would not find me in this bed. Tomorrow, I would start planning the life they would never expect me to live. Because the best revenge wasn't rage or confrontation. It was disappearance. It was silence. It was freedom disguised as absence. By the time the sun rose the next morning, my decision had already settled in me like truth that had been waiting for years. The hospital room was still filled with the low hum of machines and the faint scent of disinfectant. Ruth had gone home to shower and bring me clean clothes. Nora, the night nurse, was finishing her shift, her tired smile warm as she adjusted the tubes in my arm. "You made it through the worst, Mrs. Hayes," she said. "You should be proud." Proud wasn't the word. I felt hollow like a house after the fire's been put out, still standing but blackened from the inside. "Do you ever wonder," I asked her quietly, "why people survive?" She paused, looking at me curiously. "Because someone somewhere needs them to. And what if no one does?" She didn't answer. She just squeezed my hand and said softly, "Then you need yourself." When she left, I looked at the clock. 8:10 a.m. Daniel and Ethan still hadn't called. My sons were probably sleeping off the wine from last night's party, tangled in expensive sheets, their guilt as fleeting as the bubbles in their champagne. I pressed the call button, and Dr. Patel entered moments later. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes," he said, flipping through my chart. "You're stabilizing well. If recovery continues, you could be discharged within a week." "A week," I repeated. "That's generous, doctor, considering my children think I'm indestructible." He gave a small, sad smile. "Families can be complicated. Complicated as forgetting to buy someone flowers," I said. "What they did has a different name." He adjusted his glasses. "Have they called today?" "No," I said. "They're probably busy. Life goes on, doesn't it?" He nodded, and I could tell he didn't know how to comfort me. "You should try to rest," he said finally. The heart heals slower when the mind keeps running. When he left, I lay there staring at the ceiling. The heart heals slower. Mine wasn't healing at all. Every beat felt like it was echoing through an empty house looking for someone who'd moved away. Around noon, Ruth returned with a small paper bag. "Got you some of those shortbread cookies you like," she said, unpacking them. "They taste like childhood." "Childhood doesn't taste so sweet anymore," I said, but I took one anyway. We ate in silence for a while, crumbs on our laps, the kind of quiet only old friends can share. Finally, she set her coffee cup down. "You've been quiet since I came in. What's on your mind?" "I'm thinking about leaving." She looked up sharply. "The hospital." Everything I said. "Savannah, this apartment, this life. The boys will visit when it's convenient for them, and I'll sit by the phone waiting. I don't want that anymore." "And where would you go?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe somewhere. No one knows my name. Somewhere warm. Somewhere I can breathe without remembering who I used to be." Ruth leaned forward, her eyes worried but not surprised. "You mean it, don't you?" "Yes," I said simply. "For 67 years I've been the same woman, giving, forgiving, surviving. But last night I realized something. I was clinically dead for 4 minutes, and not a single person who shared my blood cared enough to be there. That kind of truth doesn't fade." She reached across the table and took my hand. "Then you better make sure if you leave it's because you're choosing peace, not running from pain." I met her gaze. "What's the difference? Peace doesn't need an audience," she said softly. "Pain still hopes someone will notice." I let her words settle in me. She was right. I didn't want to leave out of spite. I wanted to leave because I was done performing for people who'd stopped watching long ago. That evening, as Ruth headed home, I asked her to bring me a notebook. "What for?" she asked. "I need to write something," I said. "A letter, maybe. Or a confession. I'm not sure yet." "Margaret," she said, frowning, "this isn't goodbye, is it?" "Not yet," I replied. When night fell, Nora came back for her shift. "Can I get you anything before I start rounds?" she asked. "Paper and a pen," I said. She tilted her head. "You going to write a letter?" "Something like that." When she returned, she handed me a small notepad and a pen. "Don't overthink it," she said kindly. "Sometimes what you write is what you need to hear yourself." After she left, I sat up in bed, pulling the tray closer. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote the first words. "Dear Daniel and Ethan." The letters looked foreign on the page, distant. I stared at their names for a long time before continuing. "For 67 years I have lived for you. Every choice, every sacrifice, every moment of joy I gave away without hesitation. When your father left, I promised myself you'd never feel abandoned, but it turns out I was the one who would." I paused, tears pricking my eyes. The pen felt heavy. I wrote on. "I used to believe that love meant giving without keeping count. I didn't realize it could also mean erasing yourself one favor at a time. You took and I gave until there was nothing left but an echo. Last night when the doctor said I had minutes to live, he called you. He told you the truth, that I might not survive the night. And still you chose to stay at that party. You clinked glasses while my heart stopped 3 times. I don't know if I can forgive that, but I know I can free myself from it." I stopped writing, my hand aching. I looked out the window. The moon was bright, a silver coin hung above the sleeping city. Somewhere out there my sons were probably asleep, their wives resting beside them, their dreams undisturbed. Mine had been broken long ago. I turned the page and kept writing. "Tomorrow you'll wake up and believe nothing has changed. You'll tell yourselves Mom is fine. You always do. But this time you'll be wrong. When you read this, I'll already be gone, not dead, not missing, just gone from your world. Don't look for me. Don't call. Don't promise to do better. Promises are currency I no longer accept." I closed the notebook, pressing the cover against my chest. It felt final, like an ending I hadn't known I was capable of writing. I placed it in the drawer beside my bed and turned off the lamp. The room sank into darkness, the machine still humming beside me. I thought of my sons as children, their laughter echoing through the backyard of our old house. Daniel's scraped knees, Ethan's missing front tooth. Those memories used to make me smile. Now they only made me ache. Sometime after midnight, I dreamed of water, calm, endless, reflecting moonlight. I was standing on the shore and the tide was rising, washing away footprints that had been there for years. When I woke, I knew what I had to do. In the morning, I'd call Ruth. I'd tell her to find me a lawyer, someone who could draw up a simple power of attorney. I'd ask her to hold the letter until I said otherwise, and then when my body was strong enough, I'd leave Savannah. I wouldn't tell my sons, wouldn't leave a forwarding address, wouldn't check my phone for missed calls. For once in my life, I'd stop waiting to be found, because maybe the greatest revenge wasn't in making them suffer. Maybe it was in learning to exist without needing them at all. That thought, for the first time, didn't make me sad. It made me feel alive. 2 days passed before Daniel finally called. The phone rang just as Nora was checking my pulse. The vibration on the metal tray startled me more than I wanted to admit. I stared at the screen for a long second before answering. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice lighter than the situation. "Demanded, we just heard you were in the hospital. Why didn't you tell us?" The disbelief in his tone almost made me laugh. "You didn't hear?" I asked quietly. "The doctor called you. Twice." He hesitated. "Right. Well, yes, but we didn't realize it was that serious. You know how doctors exaggerate to be safe." "Exaggerate," I repeated. 3 cardiac arrests. I was dead for 4 minutes, Daniel. The silence that followed was so long I could hear the faint hum of hospital lights. Then he said, "But you're okay now, right? I mean, the surgery went well." "I'm alive," I said. "That's not the same as okay." He exhaled. "Mom, I know how this looks, but you have to understand we couldn't just leave Monica's event. It was important for her work. There were donors, press, everything." "And your mother dying would have been bad for the guest list?" I asked. "That's not what I meant," he said quickly. "You always take things the wrong way." I almost laughed at the irony. "Don't worry, Daniel," I said, my voice calm and cold. "You'll never have to worry about that again." "What does that mean?" "You'll find out soon enough." I hung up before he could reply. Nora looked at me wide-eyed. "Are you okay, Mrs. Hayes?" "Better than I've been in years," I said. But the truth was, my hands were shaking. It wasn't anger anymore, it was clarity. The kind that burns everything false until only truth remains. A few hours later, the door opened, and Ethan walked in holding a bouquet of grocery store flowers and a box of chocolates he probably bought in the hospital lobby. Behind him was Clara, perfectly composed, wearing a white blouse that didn't have a single wrinkle. "Mom," Ethan said, forcing a smile, "you scared us." "Did I?" I said, my voice even. "That wasn't my intention." Clara stepped forward, placing the flowers in a vase. "We came as soon as we could," she said. "It's been a crazy week." "For some of us more than others," I replied. How was the party? Ethan shifted awkwardly. Mom, please. Let's not do this. Let's not do what I asked. Tell the truth, he sighed. We know you're upset. We should have come sooner. But honestly, what would we have done here sat around watching doctors work? We didn't want to get in the way. I stared at him, my own son trying to justify abandoning his mother on what might have been her last night. You wouldn't have been in the way, I said softly. You would have been present. There's a difference. Mom, Clara interjected, her tone polite, but firm. You're taking this too personally. We didn't mean any harm. It was just bad timing. Bad timing, I repeated. Yes, I suppose death rarely checks the calendar. Clara's smile faltered. You're angry. That's understandable. No, I said, shaking my head. I'm not angry. I'm awake. The room went quiet. The beeping of the monitor filled the space between us like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Ethan looked around, clearly desperate to change the subject. The doctor says you'll be discharged soon, he said. We were thinking it might be a good idea for you to consider moving somewhere with support. You know, one of those nice senior communities. They have nurses on-site social activities. Clara's eyes lit up. Yes, we actually toured one last month for my aunt. It's lovely, private suites, a garden, even art classes. You'd love it. Would I asked. Because from where I'm sitting it sounds a lot like being put away somewhere convenient. Mom, that's not fair, Ethan said. We're just thinking about your safety. No, I corrected. You're thinking about your comfort. You don't want to worry about late-night calls or hospital visits. You want me contained. Clara stiffened. That's not true. We'd visit all the time. Like you visited last week, I asked. Neither of them answered. I looked at the flowers on the table, bright, beautiful, already beginning to wilt at the edges. You should save your apologies, I said finally. You'll need them someday. Mom, Ethan said, his voice breaking slightly. Please don't talk like that. How should I talk, I asked. Like a grateful old woman who almost died alone but is just happy her children showed up. After the weekend cleared, Clara reached for his arm. Ethan, maybe we should let her rest. That's the first sensible thing you've said, I murmured. She glared at me but stayed silent. They left soon after, their footsteps fading down the hallway. When the door closed, I felt the air change. Lighter somehow. Nora came in a few minutes later to check my vitals. Your blood pressure's high again, she said gently. They must have upset you. Not upset, I said. They just confirmed what I already knew. Which is, she asked, adjusting the monitor. That I raised good citizens, I said. Not good sons. That night I couldn't sleep. The machines hummed softly beside me, but my mind was louder. I thought of all the years I'd spent teaching my boys to stand tall, to chase success, to never depend on anyone. And now they'd learned the lesson too well. They couldn't even recognize when someone needed them. Maybe I had done this to myself. Maybe I'd made them strong and blind in equal measure. The nurse dimmed the lights and I closed my eyes, but memories flooded in. Daniel as a child running to me after scraping his knee. Mom, it hurts, he'd said, his voice trembling. It'll stop soon, I'd told him, pressing a bandage over the wound. You're brave. Ethan at 12 crying after a fight at school. They called me poor, he said. Ignore them, I told him. They don't know who you'll become. I had always taught them to move forward, to forget the pain. I just never imagined one day they'd apply that lesson to me. Around 3 a.m, I woke to a faint sound, the soft creak of the door. Ruth slipped inside wearing her night robe and slippers, her hair in a messy bun. You'll get me arrested, I whispered. Visiting hours ended hours ago. I bribed the security guard with banana bread, she said, pulling up a chair. Besides, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about you. You're the only one who does, I said. She took my hand. Have they come? They did, I said. Flowers, excuses, and a brochure for a nursing home. Ruth's expression hardened. Those ungrateful children don't, I interrupted. They're not worth the energy. So what now? Now I get better, I said. Then I leave. Leave, she repeated. You mean for good? Yes. She looked at me for a long time, then nodded slowly. If that's what you need, I'll help you. You already have, I said. She smiled sadly. You're stronger than you look, Margie. Strength is overrated, I said softly. What I want now is peace. We sat in silence, listening to the distant rumble of thunder outside. It was almost poetic how storms always seemed to follow me, and yet this time I wasn't afraid. I knew what needed to be done. When Ruth left before dawn, she kissed my forehead. "Call me when you're ready," she said. I promised I would. After she was gone, I opened the drawer beside my bed and took out the notebook. The letter I had started was still there, the ink smudged where my tears had fallen days earlier. I added one more line at the bottom. "You won't have to worry about me anymore. Tomorrow I'll be gone." I signed it simply Margaret Hayes. Then I closed it, turned off the light, and let the darkness wrap around me like a curtain closing on the final act. The rain had stopped by the time morning came, leaving the hospital windows streaked with thin trails of silver. I woke up feeling lighter, as if some part of me had already begun to detach from this sterile world of white sheets and pitying smiles. Nora entered quietly, her footsteps soft. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes," she said, checking the monitor beside me. "You slept better last night?" I made peace with a few things I said. She smiled, not asking what that meant. "Would you like breakfast, just coffee?" I replied. "And if you could you bring me a phone directory?" "A phone directory?" she repeated, surprised. "Yes, there's someone I need to find." She nodded and returned a few minutes later, setting the thick book beside me. When she left, I flipped through the pages slowly until I found the name I was looking for: Hope Jennings, Austin, Texas. My cousin. We hadn't spoken in 5 years, not since her husband died. But I remembered her last letter. "If you ever need a place to breathe, my door is open." Maybe she didn't mean forever, but right now forever sounded just right. Around 9, Ruth appeared, her umbrella dripping rain onto the linoleum floor. "You look determined," she said. "That scares me." "Good," I said. I was hoping it would. She hung her coat and sat down. "Tell me what you're planning before I start guessing." "I'm leaving, Ruth," I said plainly, "and not just the hospital, Savannah." She didn't speak for a moment, just watched me as though testing the weight of my words. "Do you know where you'll go, Austin?" I said. "I have a cousin there," she offered once. "I think I'll take her up on it." "And your boys? They'll figure it out eventually," I said. "Or they won't." Ruth shook her head. "You really mean to disappear, don't you?" "I really do, and you're not afraid of what I asked." "Being alone, I've been alone for decades, this time at least. It'll be by choice." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I spoke to my niece Sarah. She's a lawyer. If you want to leave things properly, she can help with paperwork, power of attorney, property, transfers, all that." I took the paper from her hand, my fingers trembling slightly. "You always think ahead, Ruth." "Someone has to," she said. "If you're going to vanish, you need to do it cleanly. No loopholes for those boys to drag you back. You make it sound like a crime." "Maybe it is," she said with a small smile. "A beautiful one." That afternoon I called Hope from the hospital phone. The line crackled before a warm, familiar voice answered. "Hello, Hope, it's Margaret," I said. "Margaret Hayes." There was a pause, then a delighted gasp. "Margie, oh my goodness, it's been ages. Are you all right?" "Not exactly," I said, "but I want to be." "Hope, is your offer still open?" "Of course it is," she said immediately. "This house is too big for me alone. Come whenever you want. I'll make up the guest room. What's going on, sweetheart?" "It's a long story," I said. "I'll tell you when I get there." "Then I'll expect you soon," she said. "And Margie, yes, don't look back." When I hung up, Ruth was watching me. "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure," I said. "More than I've been about anything." We spent the rest of the day talking quietly, making a list of things I'd need. Identification, savings, my medications, a small suitcase. Ruth offered to withdraw the money I'd been saving quietly for years. $8,000 I'd tucked away in an account my sons didn't know existed. Enough to start over, not enough to tempt them to come looking. That night, after the hallway lights dimmed, Nora came in with my evening medication. She noticed the paper spread across my lap, the notebook, my letter, Ruth's list, and Sarah's information. "You're planning something," she said, half teasing. "You could say that." She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "If it's something that brings you peace, I won't ask questions. But if you need help, I'll be here." "You've already helped more than you know," I said. "Do you ever want to start over, Nora?" She smiled faintly. "Every nurse does. But most of us never do." "Maybe you should," I said, "before it's too late." After she left, I opened the drawer and took out the letter I had written to Daniel and Ethan. I read it one more time slowly, letting every word sink into me. I didn't feel anger anymore, only a kind of tired acceptance. The kind that comes when you stop expecting love to arrive. I signed it again at the bottom, pressing the pen harder this time. Margaret Hayes, your mother until today. The next morning, Ruth came early with fresh coffee and the crisp scent of freedom clinging to her raincoat. I talked to Sarah, she said. She'll meet us tonight in the parking lot at 8. We'll get the papers signed quietly. Nora can help us leave without anyone noticing, I said. She's on the evening shift. Then it's settled, Ruth said. Do you have everything, just what matters? And what's that, she asked. My name, my will, and a choice, I said. The hours between morning and night felt endless. Daniel texted once around noon, glad you're doing better. We'll visit this weekend. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. Around 5, Nora stopped by with my dinner tray. Still want that favor, Mrs. Hayes, she whispered. Yes, I said. Tonight, she nodded. I'll be ready. After she left, I stared out the window at the fading light. Savannah looked golden from up here, almost forgiving. I remembered the first time I saw this city as a young woman, how full of hope I had been, how sure that love and hard work could fix anything. Now I knew better. Some things aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be left behind. Ruth arrived at sunset, a small suitcase in hand. Everything's in here, she said. Your clothes, your medicine, the cash. She placed the bag gently at the foot of the bed. You ready? I looked around the room at the blanket folded neatly at the end of the bed, at the vase of fading lilies Ethan had brought at the machine that had kept me alive through the longest night of my life. Yes, I said. I'm ready. Ruth sat beside me as the sky darkened. Do you think they'll come looking for you? Maybe, I said. But they won't find me. You'll give them the letter once I'm gone, and you're sure you don't want me to tell them where you're going? Not yet, I said. Not until I know I don't want to come back. She nodded. I'll tell them I don't know anything. Good, I said softly. Then it'll be true. The hallway grew quieter as visiting hours ended. Somewhere, a nurse laughed, the sound echoing down the corridor. It was strange how peaceful the hospital felt that night, as if even the walls knew I was saying goodbye. I lay back listening to the soft hum of the machines one last time. Do you regret anything? Ruth asked suddenly. Only waiting this long, I said. She reached over and took my hand. Whatever happens next, I want you to remember something. You're not running away, you're finally running toward yourself. I smiled faintly. That's the first birthday gift anyone's ever given me that I actually want. The clock on the wall ticked closer to 8. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply, memorizing the rhythm of this room, the sound of my own heartbeat. Soon it would all be behind me. Soon I'd be free. The morning sun crept through the blinds, slicing my hospital room into thin bars of light. I sat up slowly, feeling the ache in my chest, but also a strange calm, the kind that comes when you already know how the day will end. The clock on the wall read 7:45. Today was Sunday, the day they'd promised to visit. The day I would see them for the last time. I combed my hair, smoothed the wrinkles out of the olive green dress Ruth had brought from my apartment. It was the same color I'd worn the day I brought Daniel home from the hospital 40 years ago. I thought that was fitting. Nora came in to check my vitals, humming softly under her breath. You look beautiful this morning, Mrs. Hayes, she said. Big day? Something like that, I replied. She smiled without asking questions, though her eyes seemed to know more than she let on. Everything's ready for tonight, she whispered as she adjusted the IV line. Thank you, Nora. You've been a blessing. You sure you're ready for this? She asked. Completely, I said. It's time. After she left, I sat back against the pillows and watched the sunlight spread across the room. It touched the letter on my nightstand, the one with their names written carefully across the front. My hands didn't shake anymore when I looked at it. For the first time in years, I wasn't nervous about what my sons would think. The door opened around 2 in the afternoon. Mom Daniel's voice came first, warm but rehearsed. You look great, much better than we expected. He leaned in to kiss my cheek. The scent of his cologne was sharp and expensive, like everything about him now. Monica followed close behind, wearing a coral dress that shimmered when she moved. She carried a bouquet that matched her outfit. Margaret. "We're so relieved to see you doing better," she said. Her smile polished her tone. Pure performance. Behind them came Ethan and Clara a few steps behind, as if this were some awkward family gathering instead of a visit to a woman who'd nearly died. "Mom," Ethan said softly, "you look strong." "Stronger than I should," I said, smiling faintly. "I'm glad you all came." "Of course," Daniel said quickly. "We wanted to check on you before the week starts. Things have been crazy at work." "I can imagine," I said. "Busy lives." "Exactly," Monica said, sitting gracefully in the chair beside my bed. "But now that you're better, we can all relax." "Better," I repeated quietly. "Yes, much better." They started talking over each other then about the gala, about their week, about people I didn't know or care about. I listened politely the way you listen to strangers on a train. Their words drifted past me hollow and weightless. No one asked how I felt. No one mentioned the heart attack. I could have been recovering from a cold for all they cared. After a few minutes, Ethan cleared his throat. "Mom, we've been thinking," he said. "Now that this happened, maybe it's time we look at some long-term options." "Long-term, you know, places where you'd have care 24 hours a day," he said. "Not a nursing home exactly, more like a retirement community." "It's wonderful," Monica chimed in. "Daniel and I actually toured one in Charleston. Beautiful gardens, on-site medical staff, everything you could need. And it's affordable." I smiled faintly. "How generous of you to plan my future." "We just want you to be safe," Daniel said, missing the edge in my tone. "If something happens again, we might not get there in time." "You didn't last time either," I said. His face tightened. "Mom, that's not fair. Isn't it?" I asked. "I was dead for 4 minutes, Daniel. You were toasting champagne." "That's not what happened," he said, his voice rising. "You're twisting things." "No," I said quietly. "I'm remembering them." Monica reached over, touching his arm. "She's emotional, Daniel. It's normal. Heart trauma affects the mood." I looked at her and almost laughed. "My mood is fine, Monica. My memory is just clear." Clara shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Ethan, who avoided my eyes. The silence stretched. "Anyway," Daniel said finally, forcing cheerfulness into his voice, "we're just trying to help. We can handle the monthly payments. It'll give everyone peace of mind." "Peace of mind," I repeated, my voice soft. "That's all you're looking for, isn't it? Not peace of heart." "Mom," Ethan said, his voice pleading, "please don't make this harder than it has to be." "Oh, I won't," I said, smiling faintly. "In fact, I think you're right. It's time for a change." Their shoulders relaxed instantly. "I'm glad you see it that way," Daniel said. "We'll start looking into options right away." "Don't bother," I said. "I already know where I'm going." Monica looked delighted. "Oh, you've done some research." "In a way," I said. "I think you'll approve. It's very peaceful, far from here, quiet. No interruptions." "That sounds perfect," she said, missing entirely the weight of my words. "We'll come visit once you're settled." "I'm sure you will," I said, and the way I said it made Clara glance at me with something like unease. We talked a while longer, or rather they talked, and I nodded. They mentioned vacations, work trips, remodeling plans, all the things that filled their world. I felt like a ghost sitting among the living, unseen and unnecessary. When the clock struck 4, Monica stood up, smoothing her dress. "We should get going," she said. "Traffic will be terrible." "Of course," Daniel said, checking his watch. "Mom will call during the week. Maybe next Sunday we'll bring lunch." "Next Sunday," I said. "That'll be nice." Ethan hugged me awkwardly, and Clara gave a polite smile. "Take care, Margaret," she said. "You too, dear." Monica leaned down and kissed my cheek. Her perfume lingered in the air like something too sweet, too artificial. "Rest well," she said. "You've been through a lot." "I have," I said, "and I'm finally resting." When they left, the room fell silent again. I could still smell their cologne, hear the faint echo of their footsteps fading down the corridor. Ruth appeared at the door not long after, her face drawn but expectant. "Well?" she asked. "They came," I said. "And they left." "How do you feel?" I looked at her and smiled. "Free." She came closer, resting a hand on my shoulder. "Then it's time." "Yes," I said, turning toward the nightstand. The letter waited there, sealed and ready. I picked it up, smoothing the edges before setting it neatly on the pillow. "Tomorrow afternoon," Ruth said quietly, "I'll give it to them." Good, I said. Let them find it when it's too late to fix anything. She nodded. Are you sure you want to do this tonight? I've never been surer of anything. Nora entered, then her shift just beginning. She glanced between us and gave a small nod. The elevator by the supply room is clear. My sister's waiting downstairs. Thank you, I said. Ruth handed me the small suitcase. Everything's packed. Clothes, medicine, the money. I stood slowly, the IV already removed the hospital gown, replaced by the green dress and a long gray coat. The air outside the room felt different, alive, expectant. You ready? Ruth asked. I already left, I said. Together we walked down the hallway. Nurses passed us without looking twice. Visitors chatted softly near the waiting area. To them, I was just another patient taking a walk. No one noticed that I was leaving for good. When we reached the elevator, I looked back once. The room was bathed in golden light, the letter glowing faintly on the pillow. My heart didn't ache. It felt steady, strong. They'll come next week, I said quietly. They'll find an empty bed. And a letter that'll change everything, Ruth said. I smiled as the elevator doors slid closed. Good, I whispered. Then my silence will finally speak. The parking lot glowed under yellow lights. Rainwater gathered in shallow puddles that mirrored the sky. I stepped out of the elevator with Ruth on one side and Nora on the other. The night air hit my face, cool and wet, washing away the sterile scent of disinfectant that had clung to me for days. For a moment I just stood there breathing, letting the drizzle touch my skin. You sure about this? Nora whispered. Once you step out, there's no turning back? That's the idea, I said, pulling my coat tighter around me. A silver sedan waited near the far end of the lot. Its engine idled softly, exhaust curling like smoke from a candle. Sarah was standing beside it, holding a small folder and an umbrella. Her expression was composed, but her eyes were kind. Mrs. Hayes, she called quietly. Right on time. You're Sarah, I said as we approached. I recognized the lawyer's posture. She smiled. Guilty as charged. Ruth filled me in. Let's take care of the paperwork quickly. The hospital cameras don't focus on this side lot, but I'd rather not risk it. She handed me a pen and I signed where she pointed, one signature after another, the ink sinking into the paper like a trail of endings. Power of attorney. Asset transfer. A declaration of mental competence. Each stroke felt like cutting another string that had tied me to the old version of myself. You're free now, Sarah said softly when I handed back the pen. Legally and otherwise. Freedom feels lighter than I expected, I said. That's how you know it's real, she replied. Ruth reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope with my savings, $8,000 in neat stacks. It's all here, she said, placing it in my hand. Enough for a new start. I looked at her, my throat tightening. You've done more for me than my own family ever did. You're my family, she said. The kind you choose. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and asphalt. Sarah opened the passenger door. We'll take you to the bus terminal, she said. The 10 p.m. to Austin leaves in 40 minutes. Austin, I repeated. It sounds like another lifetime. Then it's exactly where you belong, Ruth said. I turned once, looking back at the hospital. The windows glowed like a grid of tiny moons. Somewhere inside, my sons believed I was still lying in that bed, fragile and waiting. The thought almost made me laugh. Let's go, I said. We drove through the quiet streets of Savannah, the city shimmering under the wet glow of streetlights. The rhythmic patter of rain on the windshield filled the silence. Ruth sat beside me, her hand resting on my arm. Sarah hummed softly to herself, focused on the road. Every few blocks I caught glimpses of familiar places. The diner where I'd worked, double shifts in my 30s. The little park where Daniel had learned to ride his bike. The old movie theater Robert once took me to before everything fell and apart. They all blurred into the same image, a life I had lived to keep others comfortable. And now finally I was leaving it behind. When we reached the terminal, the bus was already parked under the overhang, its headlights cutting through the mist. The sign above it read, Austin, Texas, 1000 p.m. The sight of it made my heart race. You sure you don't want me to come with you? Ruth asked. I'd stay a few days, get you settled. No, I said gently. If you come, it won't feel like freedom. It'll feel like running away. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. You'll call me when you get there every week, I promised. I'm not disappearing from you, Ruth, just from them. She smiled through her tears. Then go, before I lose my nerve. Sarah helped me with the suitcase, making sure the money was hidden beneath my clothes. You'll be fine, she said. My aunt moved to Austin after her divorce at 60. She's thriving. The city has a way of giving people new beginnings. I'll take her word for it, I said. The driver began calling passengers. I turned to Ruth one last time. We hugged tightly, her warmth grounding me. Take good care of yourself, Margie, she whispered. You deserve peace. And you deserve credit for saving me, I said. Though I don't think peace is something anyone can give, it's something you finally stop running from. I climbed the bus steps, slowly clutching the rail. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, smiled as he checked my ticket. Austin, huh? He said. That's a long ride. I've waited longer, I replied. I found a window seat midway down and watched as Ruth and Sarah stood by the curb. When the bus began to pull away, Ruth raised her hand. I pressed mine against the glass until they disappeared from view. The rain started again, gentle and steady, tapping against the windows like a lullaby. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red. As we crossed the bridge out of Savannah, I turned off my phone. No messages, no missed calls, no more waiting. The hum of the engine filled the silence. A young woman sitting across the aisle glanced over. First time heading to Texas, she asked. First time heading anywhere just for myself, I said. She smiled. Then you picked the right bus. The miles began to melt away. I thought about Daniel and Ethan, how they'd come next Sunday, flowers in hand, empty words ready, and find nothing but a letter on a pillow. They'd call Ruth, demand answers. She'd tell them the truth, I was gone by choice, not by tragedy. Maybe they'd be angry at first. Maybe they'd tell themselves I was cruel. But eventually, when the noise settled, they'd have to face the silence I left behind. And that silence would speak louder than any apology I could ever give. I leaned my head against the window, watching dark forests and small towns slip past. Somewhere near midnight, the bus stopped at a roadside diner for coffee. I stayed in my seat, half awake, half dreaming. In my mind, I saw Savannah fading behind me like a photograph left in the sun too long. All the years of servitude, of bending and forgiving, dissolved into the hum of tires on wet pavement. I wasn't Margaret Hayes, the forgotten mother, anymore. I was just Margaret, a woman who had finally learned that love without respect isn't love at all. Around 2 a.m, most of the passengers were asleep. I couldn't sleep yet. Freedom has a strange sound, the absence of worry. I thought of Hope's voice on the phone, warm and steady. You'll be safe here, Margie, she had said. We'll start fresh. I smiled in the dark. Maybe for once starting fresh wouldn't mean surviving. It would mean living. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The sky turned pale pink, streaked with silver clouds. The driver's voice crackled over the intercom. We'll be pulling into Austin in about 30 minutes, folks. Local time is 10 o'clock. I straightened my coat, feeling the weight of exhaustion and something sweeter, anticipation. When the bus rolled into the terminal, I saw Hope waiting near the curb, waving with both hands, her silver hair catching the sunlight. I stepped off the bus, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the ground beneath my feet like it belonged to me. Hope pulled me into a hug that smelled of lavender and home. Welcome to Texas, she said. You look different, Margie. Lighter. That's because I left everything heavy behind, I said. As we walked toward her car, I looked back once, not at the past, but at the empty road, stretching behind the bus. For the first time in 67 years, the horizon belonged to me. The hospital smelled of lemon polish and wilted lilies when Daniel walked in, his phone pressed to his ear, his words short and impatient. Yes, Mom's at Street Mary's, he said. We're just stopping by now. We won't be long. Behind him, Monica's heels clicked sharply against the tile. Ethan and Clara followed, quiet, their faces already drawn with guilt they didn't yet understand. The nurse at the desk looked up as they approached. We're here to see Margaret Hayes, Daniel said. She scrolled through her chart, frowning slightly. Mrs. Hayes, she repeated. She was discharged yesterday. That can't be right, Daniel said, blinking. She was supposed to stay until Friday. No, the nurse said firmly. She's no longer a patient here. Monica sighed and adjusted her purse strap. Probably paperwork confusion, she said. Check again, please. The nurse turned the screen toward her. See for yourself, Mrs. Hayes signed herself out. No family picked her up. Daniel's voice grew louder. Signed herself out. That's impossible. My mother can barely walk." Maybe she got help, the nurse said, a touch of defensiveness creeping in. She left with all her belongings. Room 217. Daniel's stomach twisted. "Can we see the room?" "Of course," the nurse said, leading them down the hall. The door was slightly ajar. The room smelled faintly of lavender and rain. The bed was neatly made, the sheets folded with care. On the pillow lay an envelope. Daniel saw his name written in his mother's handwriting, the same loops and curls that had once signed permission slips and birthday cards. His chest tightened. "What is this?" he whispered, picking it up. Ethan stepped closer. "Open it." Daniel tore it open with trembling hands. 2 names were written on the first line, for Daniel and Ethan. His voice faltered as he began to read aloud. "My dear sons, by the time you read this, I'll be far away. You won't find me because you never really looked when I was near." The words hit like stones. The room grew quiet except for the soft hum of the machines that no longer mattered. Monica shifted uncomfortably. "She's being dramatic," she muttered. "She always was." Daniel kept reading. "I recovered from everything when your father left, when I worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, when you borrowed my savings and forgot to pay them back. But I can't recover from this. From knowing that the night my heart stopped you were too busy to care." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Daniel, stop," he whispered. "Keep going," Clara said softly. Daniel's voice cracked. "The doctor told you I might not make it. You chose champagne over goodbye. You chose laughter over love. Don't pretend it was an accident, it was a choice. And now I've made mine." He looked up, his eyes glassy. "There's more," he said, almost in disbelief. He read on. "I'm not dying. I'm leaving. You won't get a call this time. No explanations, no guilt trips. I gave you everything I had, my time, my money, my forgiveness. I'm done giving. Don't look for me. Don't pity me. Just remember what you traded my love for and live with that." Ethan turned away, his shoulders shaking. Clara put her hand on his back, but he brushed it off. "There's another paragraph," Daniel whispered, his eyes racing across the page. "If you want to honor me, don't send flowers. Flowers wilt. So did your affection. If you want redemption, find it in the silence I've left behind." His voice trailed off into a whisper. "Goodbye, Mom." For a long time no one spoke. The sound of Monica's phone vibrating in her purse broke the spell. She pulled it out and silenced it quickly, her voice brittle. "Well, this is absurd. She's trying to make us feel guilty." Daniel turned to her sharply. "And is it working?" Monica's eyes widened. "Excuse me, you heard me," he snapped. "You convinced me that party mattered more than she did. You told me she'd understand." "Daniel," she said, her tone growing icy. "Don't blame me for your guilt." "Who should I blame then?" he asked. "The doctor who begged me to come. My mother for dying inconveniently." "She's not dead," Monica said. "She's playing games." "No," Clara said quietly. "She's done playing." Ethan sank into the chair by the window, burying his face in his hands. "She really left," he murmured. "She actually left." Daniel folded the letter carefully, his movements slow and deliberate. "We need to find her," he said. "Now." "And what will you say when you do?" Clara asked. "Sorry we missed your death. Sorry we only came when you were gone." Daniel glared at her. "We have to try. Try what she said. To prove her wrong. She already knows." The nurse appeared in the doorway, her voice tentative. "I have her discharge papers here," she said. If it helps, she was calm when she left. She signed everything herself. There was a friend with her. "What friend?" Daniel demanded. "Her name's Ruth," the nurse said. "Older woman, gray coat, kind eyes." They seemed close. Ethan lifted his head. "Ruth Johnson," he said quietly. "She's been around forever." Monica sighed. "Well, there's your answer. Ruth probably knows where she is. Let's go talk to her." "No," Daniel said. "Not yet." He unfolded the letter again, staring at the last line. She wrote something else. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You won't find me because I've already found peace." He pressed the page against his chest, his hands trembling. Ethan stood up. "I can't stay here," he said. "This place feels wrong now." "Then where will you go?" Clara asked. "Anywhere," he said. "As long as it's not here." Monica crossed her arms. "You're both overreacting. She'll be back once she cools off." Daniel looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You don't understand anything," he said. "This isn't punishment. This is consequence." Monica rolled her eyes. "Same thing." He shook his head. "No, punishment ends when you apologize. Consequence doesn't." He walked past her out into the hallway, the letter still in his hand. Ethan followed him silent. Clara lingered for a moment, glancing back at the empty bed, at the soft indentation on the pillow where her mother-in-law's head had once rested. "Good for you, Margaret," she whispered under her breath before turning to leave. Outside, the afternoon light was fading into the soft gold of early evening. The brothers stood beside the car in silence. Daniel's knuckles were white around the letter. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" Ethan asked. Daniel looked up at the sky, his jaw tightening. "I don't know," he said, "but if she doesn't, we earned it." He opened the car door and the paper fluttered slightly in the wind, the edges damp from his hands. Ethan watched him for a moment, then said quietly, "She was right, you know." "About what?" "About silence," Ethan said. "It's louder than we ever imagined." The drive back to their homes was quiet. No one spoke. Monica stared out the window, scrolling aimlessly through her phone, her reflection pale against the glass. Clara kept her hands clasped in her lap, the image of the letter burned into her mind. When they reached the intersection near their neighborhood, Daniel stopped at the red light and whispered to himself, "We can't undo this." The light turned green, but he didn't move. Monica asked, "The light?" He stared straight ahead. "Just wait," he said softly. "Let me sit in it a little longer." Behind them, the cars began to honk, the sound sharp and impatient, but Daniel didn't move. For the first time in his life, he finally understood how it felt to be still and to have the weight of everything you've ignored finally settle around you. In the empty hospital room, the folded sheets still carried the faint scent of lavender. The envelope on the pillow was gone, but the air felt heavier, charged with the echo of her words. "You won't find me because you never really looked." The Texas sun was softer than I remembered from my last visit decades ago. Morning light poured through the window of Hope's guest room, warming the pale yellow curtains and the wooden floor beneath them. I woke to the sound of birds instead of hospital machines, to the smell of coffee, and something sweet, pancakes maybe coming from the kitchen downstairs. For a few seconds I forgot everything, the hospital, the letter, the pain. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere. "Morning, sleepyhead," Hope called when I came down. She stood at the stove, her silver hair tied up in a messy bun, a bright blue apron wrapped around her like armor. "You're just in time. Sit." I obeyed, smiling at the spread she'd prepared: pancakes, peaches, and a small vase of wildflowers at the center of the table. "You didn't have to do all this," I said. "Nonsense," she replied. "You've been through hell. Food is medicine." I watched her bustle around, humming to herself. The simplicity of it made my chest ache. "I don't remember the last time someone cooked for me," I said quietly. "Then you're long overdue." We ate in silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't demand to be filled. After breakfast, she handed me a straw hat and said, "Come on, there's something I want to show you." We stepped into the garden behind her house, a riot of roses, jasmine, and lemon trees. The air was thick with their scent, the soil still damp from last night's rain. "You planted all this yourself?" I asked. "Every bit of it," Hope said proudly. "After Harold died, I didn't know what to do with myself. So I dug. It's cheaper than therapy and smells better too." I laughed, a sound that felt unfamiliar in my own throat. "It's beautiful. It keeps me alive," she said, clipping a rose and handing it to me. "You need something that makes you look forward to mornings, Margie. Not someone, something." Her words stuck with me the rest of the day. By noon, she'd introduced me to half the neighborhood. There was Mrs. Coleman, who baked pies for everyone on her street, and Gloria, who walked her poodle every afternoon at exactly 3:00. They all treated me like I'd been there for years. "We have a little group that meets at the park on Thursdays," Gloria said. "Just coffee, gossip, and a bit of yoga if the mood strikes. You should come." I promised I would, though I wasn't sure I meant it. The idea of belonging again felt foreign, dangerous, almost like stepping on thin ice. That evening, Hope poured us both glasses of sweet tea and said, "I'm glad you came, Margie. I always thought you were too strong for your own good." "Strong," I repeated. That's what everyone calls a woman who survives without complaining. You're not wrong, she said, but sometimes strength's just another name for loneliness. We sat watching the sun disappear behind the trees, fireflies beginning to spark in the shadows. I felt something ease inside me, something I didn't know I'd been clenching. The next morning I joined the women at the park. The air was already warm, the sky cloudless and vast. Gloria handed me a paper cup of coffee and patted the bench beside her. We were just talking about how hard it is to start over, she said. But look at you. You did it. I didn't start over, I said softly. I started late. Same thing, she smiled. Late just means brave. I liked that. Brave. Not broken, not abandoned, brave. Afterward, I walked through the local market, letting the smell of baked bread and oranges fill my lungs. I bought a small journal from a stall run by a college student. The cover was embossed with gold vines. That night I began writing again. Dear Diary, I wrote, I used to think freedom meant silence. Now I know it means choosing who gets to hear your voice. I wrote for hours until the moonlight turned the pages silver. The next week passed in a blur of small, ordinary joys. I helped Hope in the garden, joined Gloria and Mrs. Coleman for yoga that mostly turned into laughter, and even applied for a part-time job at a boutique downtown. The owner, a kind woman named Teresa, hired me on the spot. You've got great taste, she said. Women will trust you. It felt good to be needed again, even in small ways. On my third day, a man walked into the shop looking for a gift for his daughter. He was tall, gray-haired, with kind eyes that seemed to study the world before speaking to it. What would a 17-year-old like, he asked. Something that says I care without saying I'm overbearing. So something impossible, I said, and he laughed. You've got a point, he replied. I'm Henry Harrison. Margaret, I said. Nice to meet you. He left with a scarf and a smile that lingered even after he was gone. A few days later, I ran into him again at the community center. Margaret, he said, waving. They roped me into these dance classes. You too, Hope insisted, I said. She said it's good for the heart. Then we're both in the right place, he said. We danced slowly to an old blues song, my hand resting lightly on his shoulder. There was no spark of romance, just comfort, the quiet understanding of two people who'd both seen life's sharp edges and learned how to step around them. You move like someone who's learning to trust her body again, he said. And you talk like someone who reads too much into things, I teased. Guilty. The class ended, but the conversation didn't. We sat outside afterward, watching the sun set over the park. Do you miss them? He asked finally. Every day, I said. But missing isn't the same as needing. He nodded. You've got more courage than most people I know. No, I said quietly. Just more practice at starting over. Weeks passed. The guilt that had once shadowed me began to fade, replaced by something steadier, peace. I spent mornings writing, afternoons at the boutique, evenings with Hope and our little circle of friends. One night I found myself laughing so hard over a story Gloria told that tears streamed down my face. Hope looked at me across the table, smiling softly. You look 10 years younger, Margie. Maybe I finally put down the weight I was never meant to carry, I said. When I went to bed that night, I opened my journal again. Dear Diary, I wrote, I no longer feel like a ghost. I don't wake up waiting for a phone call that never comes. I water the plants, I laugh, I dance, and none of it feels borrowed. Freedom doesn't mean being unbothered. It means choosing what's worth bothering about. I closed the journal and turned off the lamp. The house was quiet but not empty. Outside, the garden rustled with life. Somewhere in the distance, wind chimes played a tune I almost recognized. I smiled to myself, realizing that the life I had now wasn't the reward for my suffering. It was proof that I had finally stopped mistaking pain for love. The morning light poured into the kitchen in golden stripes, touching the rim of my coffee cup and the edges of the newspaper I wasn't really reading. The Texas air was soft, smelling faintly of rain and lemons from the tree outside. I'd been here for 6 months, and still every sunrise felt like a small miracle. Hope was out in the garden trimming roses, her laughter floating in through the open window as she chatted with the neighbor over the fence. I watched her through the glass, thinking how strange it was that I had found family again without even looking for it. My hands didn't tremble anymore when I lifted the cup. My heartbeat was steady. Some mornings I almost forgot I'd ever been that woman lying in a hospital bed begging the universe not to let her die alone. Now I was alive, and not just breathing but living. I opened the small notebook on the table, the one that had become my diary, and began to write. Dear life, thank you for the second chance. The words flowed easily. I used to think peace was something that came after forgiveness. But peace, I've learned, comes after acceptance. The sound of Hope's footsteps pulled me from my thoughts. She came in with a handful of lemons and a mischievous smile. We're having guests this afternoon, she said. Don't make that face. Just Gloria and Henry. I laughed. You're turning into quite the social director. Someone has to keep you from hiding behind that journal of yours, she teased, placing the lemons in a bowl. And besides, Henry's been asking about you. About me, I said, pretending indifference. He's polite. That's all. Polite, she said, raising an eyebrow. That's what we call chemistry at our age. I shook my head, smiling. At our age, Hope, we don't chase chemistry. We just enjoy company that doesn't drain us. Well, she said, pouring herself a glass of lemonade, you'll have both today. By the time the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the yard, the table was set under the shade of the lemon tree. Hope's roses perfumed the air, and cicadas hummed lazily in the distance. Gloria arrived first, carrying a pie still warm from the oven. Don't let me near it yet, she warned. It's dangerous while hot. Henry came not long after, dressed neatly in a pressed shirt, holding a small bouquet of daisies. For the lady who gave me the best dance partner in Austin, he said, handing the flowers to Hope. And for the one who kept me from stepping on your toes, he added, looking at me. His tone was playful but gentle, the kind of teasing that didn't cut. You flatter me, Mr. Harrison, I said. Only the truth, he replied. Hope clapped her hands. All right, enough charm, sit down, everyone. Before the lemonade melts. We talked and laughed until the sun dipped low, painting the sky in orange and lavender. Gloria told stories about her grandchildren, Henry shared a few about his years teaching music, and Hope kept everyone's glasses full. Somewhere in the middle of it, I caught myself looking around the table, realizing I hadn't felt lonely in months. When Henry left that evening, he lingered by the gate. Margaret, he said quietly, you've got a light about you these days. Don't let anyone dim it again. I won't, I said. Not even me. After everyone left, Hope helped me gather the plates. He likes you, she said in a sing-song tone. He respects me, I corrected. There's a difference. Maybe, she said, stacking the cups, but sometimes respect is how love begins. Later that night, after Hope had gone to bed, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my knees and my diary open on my lap. The moon was bright, the stars scattered like tiny blessings across the sky. I began to write again. Dear diary, today I realized something I wish I'd known years ago. You don't need to be needed to be loved. You just need to exist in a space that doesn't demand your suffering as proof of your worth. The pen paused as I looked toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, maybe hundreds of miles away, Daniel and Ethan were still living their busy lives. Sometimes when the night was quiet, I'd imagine them opening old photo albums, stopping at pictures where I was still smiling beside them, not yet erased from their story. I didn't hate them anymore. Anger had been too heavy to carry this far. Forgiveness hadn't come easily, but it came. Not for them, for me. I whispered into the still air, I forgive you. The words drifted out soft as breath, and for the first time they didn't hurt. A few days later, I received a small envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name written in Daniel's handwriting. Inside was a single folded note. Mom, we finally understood. You were right. We forgot that love without respect isn't love at all. Wherever you are, I hope you found peace. We're trying to find it too. There was no apology, no promises, just honesty. And that was enough. I folded the letter carefully and placed it between the pages of my journal. It's over, I whispered. Hope found me later in the garden watering the lemon tree. You look lighter today, she said. Did you finally finish that book of yours? Not yet, I said. Just a chapter. She smiled. Well, the next one's already waiting. I looked up at the sky, the color of melted gold. Yes, I said. I think it is. Weeks turned into months, and life settled into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Mornings in the garden, afternoons at the boutique, evenings filled with laughter and dance. I wasn't rich, but I was content. I wasn't surrounded by family, but I was surrounded by love. The quiet, chosen kind that doesn't ask you to prove your worth. On my 67th birthday, Hope threw a small party under the same lemon tree. Gloria brought her pie, Henry played his harmonica, and the women from the park surprised me with a handmade quilt stitched with their initials. When they sang Happy Birthday, I laughed until tears filled my eyes. Hope handed me a slice of cake and said, "Make a wish." I closed my eyes, and for the first time I didn't wish for someone to return. I wished to keep everything I already had: peace, freedom, and a heart that finally beat for itself. That night I wrote one last entry. Dear life, I'm not waiting for anyone anymore. Not for apologies, not for redemption. I used to measure my worth by the love I gave away. Now I measure it by the peace I keep. I looked out the window one last time before turning off the light. The garden shimmered under the moon, alive with quiet beauty. Somewhere a wind chime sang softly and I smiled. Justice isn't always loud, I whispered to the night. Sometimes it's just a woman learning how to live again. And if anyone had been listening, they might have heard my laughter rise above the breeze, steady, whole, free. If you've ever felt forgotten, tell me, what would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed, or would you have walked away too? I'd love to hear your story. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.